Welcome to another episode of Jolene's Book and Writers Talk podcast, brought to you by Southern Dragon Publishing. Today we're honored to host a deeply moving conversation with Kenneth D. Wald, author of The Ghost on the Wall, a grandson's memoir of the Holocaust. After a distinguished academic career, Ken stumbled upon a hidden trove of letters written by his Jewish grandparents trapped in Nazi Germany. What began as a quiet discovery exploded into a transcontinental journey of memory, grief, and historical justice. In this episode, Ken opens up about the emotional search for the truth, the silence of the Holocaust survivor families, and the unexpected allies who helped give voice to his family's stolen past. We talk about denial, resilience, and why, now more than ever, personal stories are essential in keeping history alive. Stay with us as we go beyond the pages and into the heart of remembrance.
Hello, my name is Ken Wald. I spent most of my career as an academic teaching at the University of Florida, but the book that I'm going to be talking about is a very different kind of book from my academic work. It's the story about my family's encounter with the Holocaust. My parents were Holocaust survivors. They were German Jews who managed to get out in 1939, but my father's parents were unable to get out, and they were killed, we believe, in the Sobibor concentration camp. Growing up, I knew very little about the family because my parents and our friends who also were Holocaust survivors didn't talk about what happened. But eventually, curiosity got the better of me, and I pursued that story. And the result is the book, The Ghosts on the Wall.
Very good. So my first question is, doing a personal research, were you able to find any good historical resources for pictures and other stories besides your family's account?
Yeah, I was actually very lucky. Most people who grew up in families with Holocaust survivors have almost no material, no records, because they had to leave those wherever they got out. In the case of my parents, they both were able, although it was a dangerous situation, to get out and to bring a lot of material with them. So the major thing that really set me on the path of writing this book was the discovery in 1986 of a cache of letters that my grandparents had sent to my father in the United States. They were in Berlin at this point, and though they were not able to get out, they were able to write. And after my father's death, my brother and I were going through his files to find things to settle his estate. And initially it was very boring. We found a lot of documents, but they weren't very interesting. But then I picked out this folder from the file cabinet, and there were these roughly 150 letters that my grandparents had written. I don't read German or speak German, but I knew they were important. And that really is what set me on the path to writing this book. And then along the way, I kept finding other materials. It turns out our family on my father's side was the only Jewish family in a town near Dresden in Germany. And when my grandparents were gone and years later, there were several people in the town who decided to write a history of the town under the Nazis. And that history was our family. We were the only Jews in the town. And a lot of these people collected archives of materials. And once we connected years later, they sent those materials to me. So I was very lucky. And on top of that, I discovered, again, what I hadn't realized. My father gave a public talk about his experiences in Germany in 1978. And I had a friend who was able to get a videotape of that for me. And then my mother gave an interview to the Holocaust Visual History Archive, which was created by Steven Spielberg at the University of Southern California. And so she did about a 2-hour interview. And again, I had access to this material. But all of this stuff fell into my hand. I wasn't aware that this existed. And so I consider myself very lucky to have enough material to do this. And then I just found lots of things on the web, on Ancestry. Every few months as I was writing the book, I would Googling members of my family. And one year it suddenly popped up a link to the U.S. National Archives in Kansas City, Missouri. And it turns out when people who were enemy aliens, and technically my father was arriving as a German citizen in New York, he signed up for the draft. And when he got drafted, he received a questionnaire from the Selective Service System. And this was sent to all people who were technically enemy aliens. And instead of just filling it out pro forma, he added a fair amount to that questionnaire. So I didn't know these things existed, but I was able to get a copy from the National Archives. And similarly, he, in the Army, was in military intelligence, and I was able to get a lot of his records. So again, I probably have more information about my family than almost anybody I know, which is unusual, again, for a family of Holocaust survivors.
As an author, a new author, were you traditionally published?
This book is published by a hybrid press. There's a specialized press in Amsterdam called Amsterdam Publications, and they're dedicated to keeping alive the memories of the Holocaust. And so they publish a lot of biographies, memoirs, and the like. And I was very pleased because they take that responsibility very seriously.
And recently on social media, there has been a lot of, I don't want to say disinformation, but disbelief that the Holocaust ever happened. I don't know how to ask this. Have you heard the newer generations are not believing that all this could happen? It's fake news or whatever. Are you trying to help them understand about this, what actually happened?
Yes, a lot of the reason I wrote the book is in part to counter the Holocaust misrepresentation and lies that have taken place. And for that reason, I've really worked with people in education. For example, in Gainesville, Florida, in Alachua County, where I live, we have worked with a school board, and they now mandate Holocaust education in the junior year of high school. And on November 6th, which is an important date, I gave a talk from at one high school, which was streamed to all the other high schools. So all the juniors in the county would understand what happened. And the way I approach this is to tell people that the Holocaust is so massive, so almost incomprehensible, that people don't quite know how to make sense of it. And in my perspective, it's really probably important to tell this story one family at a time. People, I think, can make sense and get a better feel for this when it's a family as opposed to a nation or an ethnic group. And so what I do is tell the story of my family. I tell the story of my grandparents, their efforts to get out of Germany, their history. My grandfather, for example, was decorated with the Iron Cross in World War I. He was a German patriot. My family had been in Germany for well over a century, very integrated, very well respected, until the Nazis came to power. And then the Nazis engaged in dehumanization, denial of respect, and ultimately the destruction of people like that. And then I talk about how both of my parents got in the States and what it was like for them. They were not in camps, but my father actually was in a camp for about 3 weeks. But talk about how they tried to build a new life and about the anti-Semitism they encountered in the United States. It was by no means as horrible or as toxic as you had elsewhere, but there were Holocaust deniers when I was growing up. We had a couple in Lincoln, Nebraska, where I lived. So my hope is that people will understand through these family histories the costs of this kind of intolerance and why it's not restricted to Jews. There were a lot of non-Jewish victims of the Nazis as well. But my sense is that when you focus on a small group, it's a lot more, it's easier to wrap your head around what happened. And so that's really what I've pushed for. The other thing that really struck me in writing the book, I was very shocked to learn things that I just had no idea about. For example, my father, as I mentioned, did go into the U.S. Army, and he was being trained in field artillery in Oklahoma. But he suddenly got plucked out of Oklahoma and was sent to Stanford University in California, where, among other things, he was taught policing, including interrogations and things of that nature. And then his whole group was sent to Camp Ritchie in Maryland, which was the center of the Military Intelligence Command for the United States. And they had realized they had no way of collecting battlefield information, battlefield intelligence during World War II. So they brought together people from who had the background in the countries that the United States was fighting. And because the biggest place where that happened was Germany, they recruited German Jews who had escaped to the United States and were already in the army. And they used them to collect intelligence after battles were over. They would interview the German prisoners of war. And I discovered, much to my surprise, that my father did interrogations of captured German soldiers. In fact, he actually interrogated two people who he grew up with in his hometown. They were just German soldiers. And while interrogating them, it came out that he was somebody they'd gone to school with, and they knew the family very well. And that was just totally unknown to me. So I really learned a lot about, all sides of my family.
Cool. I found out part of my family was from Germany, but they came just after the Civil War, and they settled in Illinois. Of course, they were farmers, but they were born and raised in Germany. Have you ever had a chance to go to Germany?
Yeah. Before I knew any of this, I was giving some talks at a conference in Germany, and my wife came along with me, and we went to my mother's hometown, which was in West Germany. It's on the Romantic Road area. We met some people who had known my mother when growing up in the town. My mother started talking more about her experiences in her 80s after my father had died. And she talked about having these neighbors who at night, they had two young sons, and the sons would bring food over under cover of darkness, because to feed Jews was something that was forbidden by law. Jews had 1 hour a week they could go to a grocery store. And when we were in the town, I met one of the young men who had saved my mother's life by doing this, a Christian. And so I learned some interesting things there. But then I did a Fulbright study tour some years later in Germany. And I decided to go visit my father's hometown. I hadn't been able to do this before because it was in East Germany. But after the wall fell in 1989, it became open. And it turned out in this town, there were three men led by the Lutheran pastor of the town who, as I mentioned, were studying the Holocaust in the town and what it was like under the Nazis. And I didn't meet them in this first time. I met some other people who had been friends of the family. But a week or so after I got home, I was contacted by the minister, and he told me what they were doing. We became friends. I went back for several trips. I met people. My grandparents had a dry goods store, textiles mostly, and I met some of the nieces and children, grandchildren of people who'd worked in the store who knew my grandparents, and they told me stories about them. And then in 2008, the town built and dedicated a monument to my grandparents. It sits just outside the building that housed their store, which has been reconstructed as it looked back in 1928, I think, when it was first built. So I consider, in a sense, I have three hometowns now, four. I have Gainesville, Florida, where I live, Lincoln, Nebraska, where I was born, Erlangen, my mother's hometown in the western part of Germany, my father's hometown in Saxony in the southeast. So I talk in the book about achieving a kind of a reconciliation with Germany, because I was raised to hate Germans and anything connected to Germany. My parents, because they were raised in Germany, actually had some positive feelings. Their whole experience wasn't awful. It's really after 33 that things turned bad. But to me, I hated everything about Germany. And over time, getting to know the people who have gone out of their way to give us memories and to honor the family's memory, I've achieved a degree of reconciliation. And I've come to respect that Germany has probably tried more than any other country involved in World War II in Europe to acknowledge what happened and its responsibility. You won't find that in Poland, you won't find that in Switzerland, even in France. There's a lot of denial and the like. Germany, I have to say, has done better than all of those countries. I think I've met a lot of Germans who to this day feel a very powerful sense of guilt and responsibility, and that I'm able to have friends who are German would have astonished me if you told me about this before any of the reconciliation happened.
So how is your German? Is it getting any better?
I pretty much had some kitchen table German growing up, but apparently in a letter my father wrote to his sister, who got out of Germany and ended up in South Africa. People would go wherever they could go. Anyway, he
Right.
wrote that his sons, my brother and I, apparently when we started school, we spoke English with German accents. And this was not a good thing to have in the early 50s. So my parents at that point resolved not to speak German in our presence. And we sound like middle Americans, which is what we were. Even in Lincoln, a small city, there were about a dozen survivor families, and these were our network. These were all Central European or German Jews, and this is who my parents socialized with. Now, they had other networks. My father was a CPA, and he had a lot of clients and so forth, but the survivors were the people they socialized with. Even though many of them came from Poland or other places, they all spoke German at these meetings when they got together. And occasionally in arguments, they break into English. So I overheard some of this that I wasn't supposed to hear. But no, I sometimes wish that I had learned German. I remember very strongly at one point, I was talking about what I was going to take for classes at the university. And I said to my father, I'm thinking I might take a German class. And my father looked at me and said, oh, that's interesting. I'm thinking I might break your arm. Now, he was not a violent person. He wanted us to know about Germany, but he didn't want us to speak German. It was his approach. He and my mother only went back one time to Germany. My mother went back to her hometown because she wanted to visit her grandmother's grave, which is in a very well-kept Jewish cemetery. And she could only spend a day there. People asked her to stay and to have meals. There was a reunion going on, but she couldn't. As she said, she couldn't sleep in Germany. So she and my father drove to Switzerland, and they never went back. They were very, as you would expect, ambivalent. They loved the United States. And there were things they admired about Germany. They thought that its national health insurance was something that should be adopted in the US. Germany had much more generous pensions for people who'd worked there. So there were things they recognized. Germany had turned its back on them, and they could never love it the way they loved the United States, which saved their lives.
With the advent of social media going worldwide, like TikTok, you meet a lot of people from around the world. And I've noticed that Americans are moving to Germany because of the excellent benefits there and the opportunities of learning and that sort of stuff. So they're telling us, showing us picture videos and talking to other people that live there and how clean it is and that sort of stuff. They're putting in a lot of effort to try to not forget, but to honor what happened and to move past it as best they can.
As my parents, both under Nazi law, any Jew who left Germany and said they were not coming back would instantly lose their citizenship. So my parents were both, even though the US defined them initially as enemy aliens, they were actually stateless people, but they both were able to get into the United States. And some years later, Germany has created a program and a policy that the descendants of Jews from Germany who lost their citizenship are entitled to German citizenship. So I could get citizenship also for my children and the like. And I had been thinking about doing it at some point, and I talked to some attorneys there, and at the end of the day, they said to me, yeah, I have so much documentation, it should work out just fine. But at the end of the day, I couldn't take that step, even though I like people, and even though it wouldn't have required me to live in Germany. With German citizenship, you can live anywhere in the EU, and there are lots of places. I regret that Britain left the European Union because I've spent 2 years in Britain at various times doing research. But the German citizenship was just a step too far for me. It was a difficult decision to make, but at the end of the day, I just felt I would have trouble sleeping at night.
What about your children?
One of my children initially refused to visit the town where my father came from, refused to visit it with us the first time. My younger daughter was fascinated by the history of our family, so she was very excited to come over. And my brother came over with his daughter, and the cousins really were interested in it and really had a good experience. So I think my youngest daughter can go without a problem. My older daughter became an Israeli. And I think given that, she just has very difficult feelings toward Germany. Her husband is also from an Israeli family. They appreciate what I did. And it's a standing joke. The memoir, The Ghosts on the Wall book, is probably the first thing I've written that they're going to read. I wrote the first textbook in the field of religion and politics. It was not a field when I started, and it's now coming out in its 9th edition. And I dedicated each one of those to my daughters. And the standing joke is that it's been dedicated to them 8 times, and they'll never read it. So on the last book I wrote, which was a different book, I said, I've given up on my daughters, but now that we have grandchildren, I'm going to dedicate it to them in the hope that they'll actually read the book. Now they're curious, and they both came to respect the 3 men in my father's town who ultimately succeeded in creating that monument to them. This man came over to the States at one point. Actually, he came over to the States for our youngest daughter's wedding. We felt that was important. He's part of the family. And then one of the relatives or her husband spoke German and took them around the Northeast and the like. She has a good memory. And I have enormous respect for this man who really brought our family back to town. He has an interesting history. He was raised or was born in a non-religious family, but at a certain point, he became a Christian. And then it came time for him after he finished high school to serve in the East German Army, as it then was. And he said he was not a pacifist. He believed that war was sometimes necessary. But he said the East German Army basically existed to shoot other East Germans in the back as they were trying to get out of the country. And he said he couldn't justify that morally. So he refused military service, which was mandatory. And because of that, he was not able to go to university. You had to have had your military service. So instead, he went to a seminary, but he had really wanted to be a scientist, but that wasn't on the table. So instead, he became a pastor and devoted much of his life, even before we met, to Jewish-German reconciliation and understanding. He looks to me like an Old Testament prophet. He's tall, looming, and he's got very bright eyes that kind of bore into you. And again, he and these 2 other guys really are responsible for bringing us back to the town.
Are you writing any other books?
Yeah, everybody asks me that. At this point, I don't have any plans because I'm really spending my time trying to promote the book, setting up opportunities to give talks. There are talks being arranged actually in Lincoln, Nebraska, my hometown where my father and mother lived. And so I'm really focusing on promoting the book at the moment. So I haven't really thought further ahead to what I'm going to do. I think I told the family story pretty thoroughly. There isn't a lot left, I think, to tell, but there are other topics worth exploring.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's all kinds of topics out there.
I'm really lucky in that somebody who I respect, a journalist, said, join a writing group, because I had to learn, again, how to write, not like an academic for academics, but for a general audience. And that's a tough thing to learn how to do. And so I followed her advice and joined a couple of writing groups. And one of them is the Gainesville Writers Alliance, it's called. They have pods where you get together. And we created a pod of people who were writing memoirs that we wanted to get published. And there were only 4 of us. So our meeting every 2 weeks was really good. We got a lot of feedback and the like. And I learned a lot of things since there was nobody else who was Jewish in the group, that I might have assumed people knew, but in many cases they didn't. But the other group developed, it was a group in Jacksonville, which is about 60 to 90 minutes away from Gainesville. And it was created by a remarkable woman named Stacy Goldring. And she has created an ongoing writers' workshop explicitly for the children or now grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. And this is essentially my peer group. Now, I wasn't going to be able to make the trip up to Jacksonville every month and back. It's a long drive, and particularly when I was teaching, I just didn't have that flexibility. I was lucky in the sense that COVID required that to be moved online, and it brought in a lot of people who are not from the Jacksonville area, who are much farther away. And we had these amazing discussions among ourselves about what it's like and what it was like to grow up with parents, and in some cases grandparents, who experienced the Holocaust. and how that has affected our own personal identity. And I've read some remarkable things that people have written. And we're not all the same. Every survivor's experience was different, but there are some commonalities that were really striking. I learned, for example, that many of us played a role for our parents, particularly our mothers, as kind of protectors in a strange way. My father acculturated very quickly. He'd learned English as a child, and he was in the business world. And to hear my father, you would not have known that he wasn't a Native American. He spoke perfectly, and he had business clients and partners, and he integrated well. My mother did not know English when she arrived in the United States, or she knew very little of it. She worked for a while, but then when my brother and I were born, she became a full-time housekeeper and mother. And her English was never superb. She could communicate, but almost her entire social network were these women who'd had been survivors or children of survivors. And so we played almost a mentoring role, I think, for our mothers. And again, we had a very good life and our families were functional, but both of my parents had mental breakdowns connected to their experiences in Germany. My mother had two of them. In both cases, I was the only one at home, and I was like 11 years old. And she forgot about them later. I never did in that sense. And my father, I think, lived his whole life, according to my mother, feeling guilt as a survivor that he didn't get his parents out. And I know from the letters that his grandparents wrote to him that he was moving heaven and earth to get them out. And it was just really a matter of bad luck that they didn't get out. My mother was able to get her father and her sister out. Her mother had died of natural causes, so she didn't have that feeling of guilt, but my father really did. I don't want to say that it was a horrible life, because it wasn't. Our parents cared about us and the like. I've used the term the ghosts on the wall, because on the wall in our dining room, opposite where I would sit for Friday night Sabbath dinners, there were 3 pictures, black and white portraits, and they stared at me. I couldn't have told you back then which of these people went with which of my parents. I didn't know who was my father's mother or my mother's mother. And so they were not real to me. I would say they were ghosts who didn't haunt me. The first time I came back from the town in Germany, I called my brother to tell him about the stories I had been told about my father's parents. And we didn't have a term to use for them. So eventually, we'd never referred to anybody as grandfather or grandmother, grandma or grandpa, because they were all gone by the time we were born. And to call my father's parents Mr. and Mrs. Schoenwald was very formal. It didn't make any sense. So that whole conversation, we talked about dad's dad and dad's mom. And I would say it was another 10 years before I could say the phrase, my grandfather or my grandmother. It just wasn't in the vocabulary. And in a way, I didn't understand. I didn't get what being a grandparent or a grandchild meant. I didn't understand the relationship. I knew what it was, but I didn't grasp the emotional side of it. And of course, I now have 6 grandkids, 4 biological and 2 bonus, and it's the best experience in the world. But growing up, I just didn't get this. And again, with this dozen families, there was only one family that had 3 generations, but most of them were all 2. Those sorts of things, I think, marked my growing up. But at the same time, my parents were just very silent. They did not want us to know what happened. They did, in a way. For example, there was a very famous film called Judgment at Nuremberg about the Nuremberg war trials. It didn't show in Lincoln, but it was showing at a theater in Omaha, which is only an hour away. So my father bundled my brother and I off to go see the movie. Now, I think I was 12 when this happened. The only question he would answer, there was a character in that movie played by Judy Garland, who was mentally disabled, and she'd been forcibly sterilized. And my father explained to us what sterilization meant. They wanted us to know the heritage a bit, but they would not talk about their personal lives until much later. So we grew up in a vacuum about this, and that's why my grandparents were ghosts, and they're ghosts who have now taken on corporal form. And I think about them, I imagine conversations we would have had. I love the way in their letters they wrote. They were incredibly supportive of my father. He was alone in the US and had trouble getting a job, and they just bucked up his spirits. And so I know them as people now. They're not just the ghosts. They're real people who are a kind of a presence in my life, which I'm very grateful for.
Excellent. I want to thank you for participating. Well, that was an interesting interview. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. If you did, we hope you will like, subscribe, comment, and share our posts with your social media and your friends and family. If you're an author or anyone else in the book business and would like to be part of our podcast, we would love to have you. Check out the website, southerndragonpublishing.com, and there's a tab for the podcast. Check it out. We'll see you next time.